So our topic today is Korea-EU relations. I'm Mark Tokola, Vice President of the Korea Economic Institute, KEI, and we're privileged to have with us to talk about Korea-EU relations Dr. Kim Heungchong. Dr. Kim is President of the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, KIEP. He's also President of the European Union Studies Association of Korea. So I have a long-standing interest in the EU myself. I spent 2 years on the State Department's EU desk. I was 8 years at the US mission to the EU in Brussels, and I have a degree in EU law from the University of Edinburgh. So to set the scene, let me just point out that there are today 3 economic superpowers in the world: US, EU, and China. The 3 are all about the same size, and the 3 together make up more than half the world's economy. So the EU is a major player. To begin with the basics, Dr. Kim, how important a partner for Korea is the European Union? And how do you have different relationships with the EU versus with the member states like France, Germany, or the Netherlands?
Well, Korea has diplomatic relations with the European Union, actually the former organization of the EU, in 1963. And so that is the much later than the Korea's diplomatic relations with the European countries like the Germany or France. And the reason is that at the time the EU is not so strong and the supranational entities, as you know. And so now, after the Lisbon Treaty, now there are more and more room for the exclusive competence areas, as you know, of the European Union. So based on this kind of the structural change, now the EU is getting more important partner of Korea, Republic of Korea. So there is the kind of the functional aspects. So we need to talk about the European Union, Brussels authorities when we are thinking about the commercial policy, when we are thinking about the customs, when you're talking about the competition policy, cooperation between Korea and the EU, European countries. So there is a functional enlargement of the European Union. But now I think that the Korea and the EU is, the meeting this place is something more wider than just commercial areas. Because of the after the pandemic, after the US-China strategic competition, and then there are more aspects that both parties to talk about the issues, like the pandemic cooperation, like the actually value discussion on universal value, because there are now the big challenges from China and other countries to talk about this issue. And also we are now talking about the security. Security is, many people easily to ignore the security issues, security cooperation between the Korea and the EU. But when you're talking about the security issues in global atmosphere, then you may think of the Russia and China. And then Russia always thinking about the security issues all in one, which means that when Russia is thinking about the security issues in Europe, they're also thinking about the security issues in Far East Asia as well, because for them there is the same security issues. But the EU and European Union, EU and then Korea has the less chance to talk about these issues. One reason is that because, of course, there's ignorance of the security cooperation between the longer partners. If the geographical distance is quite large, then only economics matters, not the security issue, not the immigration or refugee issue, something like that. But the other issue is that now because of this kind of the collective decision-making system of our counterpart, we need to talk about these security issues as well. And then there is, I think that some big changes actually after 2010s or the 2015s, after the strategic competition of the European, the China and the United States, I think, yeah.
Yeah, when I was working on EU issues and the public would ask me, how we deal with the EU and the member states, I'd tell them you have to do both. Because there are some areas still reserved by the member states for their competence. As you say, there are things they're responsible for, some issues, education, for one. But if you're going to talk about influencing EU policy, then you have to talk to the member states about how to influence EU policy.
Yeah.
So it's all the same thing.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
And on this division between security and economics, up until 2016, the EU and NATO didn't talk to each other. That was the first year they actually had a document where they agreed that they needed to cooperate. And my estimate, maybe now, is that NATO does 80% security, 20% economics, where the EU does 80% economics, 20% security. So it has kind of merged together. So I saw that Korea's opened a mission to NATO in Brussels. So how do you talk to NATO and the EU separately or together?
You know, I mean, EU and NATO is a separate organization.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that there is some kind of the tension actually between NATO and the EU. But I think of most of the EU member states are now NATO members, except some very few countries like the Malta, Austria, or Ireland. Now the Sweden and the Finland will join the NATO. So, but there are huge other European members, European and other members actually in the EU, in the NATO actually, who are not yet EU member states. So, which means that there are some more things that NATO would consider when they have a decision making, and also the NATO is led by the United States. That is very, very important thing. And then, as far as I know, the European countries has not yet they have the proper, their security defense actually the facilities on their own. So, which means that the NATO cannot be replaced by the EU. And then, of course, I mean the French President Macron the insisted to strengthen the European army, something like that. But I think that is a very long way. So there is a kind of the kind of division of role between the EU and the NATO in dealing with the many conventional security issues, and also as well as the non-conventional new security issues as well. So I think,
Yeah, I think there's some case for the EU having some military capability. They have done anti-piracy work.
Yes.
They have had EU badged soldiers working in East Africa. I mean, it's not NATO, clearly. But to me, one advantage would be that if NATO should have the first refusal, if there's an issue, we, the United States, would like to have NATO decide first whether NATO should act. But if NATO decides not to act, then maybe it's not a bad thing to have the EU capable to act on its own.
Yeah.
So it'd be a backup in a way.
Yeah. It's a kind of that. They can cooperate. Each other, but still, I think that there are quite a limited capability of the EU army's operation. Yeah, not only in their own communities, but also the neighboring countries, including Sahel or the Sub-Saharan Africa as well. And so I think that there will be more chance, for the two organizations to cooperate in the near future, because now the EU has more thinking about their own security, and including economic security issues as well. And then another factor, what I'm thinking is that now all the European member countries are now try to increase the defense expenditure. Mm-hmm. And then, so what does it mean? Is there the increasing defense expenditure can lead to the kind of the strengthening the NATO capability, or their own member countries defense securities capability? So maybe the latter one is more emphasized now. So there is a growing concern, I think, that between the two organizations and that the increasing of the defense expenditure in the near future.
Yeah, it's true. I saw even Ireland is doubling its defense budget, and so European states seem intent on building up their abilities, their capabilities. But to me, one model too of the EU, NATO, and US and Korea was the Madrid June summit, the NATO summit this year.
Yeah.
For the first time ever, NATO invited South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand to join that summit. Yeah. And the EU attends NATO summits in its own right. So in Madrid in June, we actually had all the players together in the same place.
It's very interesting to see that the name of NATO is a North Atlantic. North Atlantic. They invite North Atlantic organization, treaty organizations now invite the Pacific 4 Pacific countries, yeah, including the Republic of Korea. So, but I accept the kind of concept because, as I told you, now all the regional security issues now connected. So that NATO should have a kind of the geographical concept, how to improve their role actually in the world, and of course NATO should focus on the regional the security issues in Europe and those Atlantic areas. But in order to protect improve their defense capability in that region, they need to consider that what's going on and what kind of the cooperation they should do. I mean, with the outer partner. So I think that is a kind of the evolution of their way of thinking. Yeah.
I think NATO has always been clear and is clear today that its primary job is to protect the North Atlantic area.
Yeah.
But I think they see the threats to the North Atlantic area as coming from the wider world too.
Yeah.
If you read NATO's Indo-Pacific strategy, they talk about that, how vital Northeast Asia is. And it was interesting too to me that at the June NATO summit, NATO issued for the first time a statement on China, where they called China a threat to NATO, NATO's interests. And so the difference between Atlantic and Pacific seemed to be kind of collapsing. Maybe the idea of thinking about the Pacific and Atlantic theaters as being completely different things has become a little bit outdated.
Well, France argue that they are Pacific country. Yeah,
Right.
of course.
Yes.
I mean, because they have a New Caledonia. Yeah. But I think there is the return of the Mackinder's idea. Yeah, all the ideas about and the Indo-Pacific areas. It's something like the crescent areas of the Mackinder's idea. Yeah, and the heartland is something like Russia and China, or other stand countries. Now, so it's very interesting to see that all the crescent areas. This is Europe. This is Asia Pacific in Pacific, and this is Indian Ocean. So I think it's very natural for the European countries to think about the Indo-Pacific strategy, not because the Mackinder argument, but because the natural logic for how to secure our securities, how to secure our well-being, something like that. If you think about this kind of things, issues, then just a natural logic of the thinking is that geographical tightness and cooperation in the Indo-Pacific areas. So I think that is very natural thing, to think about the EU's growing interest in the Pacific strategy, the areas.
Yeah, and I think the Americans especially are used to thinking either to the left or the right. We're thinking oceanically.
No. Yes, after United States stood the greatest, the biggest country, especially after the Second World War, then Mackinder's ideas like the geopolitics, more or less, disappeared, because the third party, the biggest one, just overshadowed all this old continent. So all this kind of the orders just shattered. But now it's growing. The necessity to think about this kind of old geographical, considerations now. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is the background for all kind of the growing interest of the European Union to think about the Indo-Pacific. Yeah.
Yeah, it's even based on the way you look at maps. When you look at American maps, it's always the Western Hemisphere in the middle, and then the oceans and Europe and Asia. But if you look from the North Pole down, you can see that Brussels is closer to Seoul than it is to Washington.
Yeah.
We need to think more
yes.
Hemispherically rather than oceanically.
Yes. Yeah.
But speaking of that, the China relationship. So as I said, we basically have the United States, EU, and China now that are the three powers. In April, there was a summit between China and the European Union, April 1st summit. And the summit did not go well, as we understand it from the outside, partly because the Chinese kept talking to the EU as if it was a junior partner of the United States.
Oh my God.
Well, I think they assume, maybe some of the diplomats in China think of the EU as being kind of an adjunct of the US. I'm not sure they understand it as well as they should. So from your point of view, how do you see the difference between EU and US?
economic matters different. I talked many times with the European European government officials, high positions officials, and they always argue that the EU and the US, the both parties have interests different, especially in economic and trade matters, and also the energy issues as well. And still, even now, I cannot reveal the name of the person, but very important person, the responsible people still argue that the United States and the EU's interests must be different because their position is different now in the world. Position in the world is different, and also my feeling is that we Koreans, our way of thinking about China is something different from the Europeans. Thinking about China, simply because China is remoted to them, and the Europeans always thinking about China as economic partner. And even now, growing tensions between the United States and China, in many ways, aspects, still they think that China is the economic partner. It's like, and Russia, how about Russia? And the Europeans thinking is that, Russia is a threat. Is that Russia as an economic partner? Yes, a little bit, but the major threat, against the European security, something like that. So that kind of the sentiment is quite makes sharp contrast to that the East Asian peoples thinking about Russia and China. We think that Russia, okay, of course, Russia is neighboring the North Korea, but more or less Russia is something like the economic partner, and cooperation for the future industry, rather than the real threat to the to our security. And one more reason for the kind of way of thinking is that look at the map, and now the many people argue that the Russia and China is the two big giants who try to change the status quo. Okay, but what is the status quo, and what is the old territory? If we think of the old territory, compare the old border and the new border, then in eastern part of the Russia and China, there was no change since the Qing dynasty. No change. Oh, of course, the Russia just conquered some areas, but there was no big change. But if you think of the western part of the boundaries, then there was much changes after Soviet Union, after Russian Empire, after Soviet Union, and now the Russia. So when the two giants is talking about the change of status quo, that is more or less the western part of the Russia and China. So not the eastern part. So that kind of the thinking is that East Asian people think that more focusing on the economic matters, but any kind of the possibility of war or possibility of the threat of the security of the East Asian people like that. So thinking so there is a kind of the change, the difference between in sentiments, how to look at the Russia and China and East Asia and Europe. Okay.
Yeah. So geographically, it's important to see where countries are. But I saw one map of the world drawn as if it was based on economic weight rather than on geographic weight.
Yeah.
Same map, but countries shrunk or got bigger depending on their economies. And on that map, Russia hardly mattered. It was just a very thin line across top of China.
Yeah.
Because the Russian economy is now smaller than South Korea's. It's smaller than Italy's.
Yeah.
And it's shrinking. The Ukraine war may have been economic catastrophe for Russia.
Yeah.
So given that reality, it's not surprising the EU and China are kind of looking past Russia towards each other.
Yeah, yeah. And not only the European Union, but also German Chancellor made a visit to China very recently, recently. And then Germany still thinks that Russia is a real threat, but China is the economic partner. And actually in Chinese market, many Korean companies have big difficulties actually in making money in China, Chinese market, while the German companies are doing really well, really well. Still, I think that the German companies are maybe very few of the exceptional cases who can make money in Chinese market now, still. And so the concept of the how to see the China is quite different from country to country now. And then many European countries still think that, of course, they are very angry because the China took so many merger and acquisition around the 2010s, many European companies, and then they took to many high technologies. So now the growing concern about that kind of thing. So they enacted some kind of laws prohibiting the Chinese the investment, merger and acquisition to the European companies. But still, the European opinion leaders still think that China is partner.
Yes, I think that's right. I think they see opportunities. But on the other hand, EU at the April China-EU summit refused to sign the bilateral investment treaty. But China really wanted badly. And the EU refused to sign it basically on values. They said they could not carry through with it.
Yes, but when you're talking about the KAI, you need to think about the how KAI is going, how was going. There was some problems actually for the perfect agreement, but suddenly China just accept some difficult, some conundrum issues actually, and then the KAI was signed. Then China was one of, and the European counterpart was very surprised because China was so, how can I say, so hostile to some European people, including the EU, the congressmen that attacking some kind of the human rights issues, something like that. So from the Chinese part viewpoint, they should act something. So just but from the Europeans' viewpoint, China attacked in advance. So the Europeans are also surprised. So now there is a very, very little room for both parties to move. So that is it takes time for both parties to advance the process for the approval of the KAI. But now that there is no big chance for the two parties to agree. To enter into force.
Yeah, we talked earlier about the kind of merging of Pacific Atlantic interests, but I wondered too about the merger between national security and economic policies. It feels like they're getting to be the same thing.
Now it's integrity.
Today.
Now that we call it the economic security.
Right.
Okay, so I think that the economic security was very just a common thing in the whole history of the world, and then just since after the Second World War, and especially after the 1990s, a very short period of the 3 decades or 6 decades was the very exceptional period that we tried to ignore the economic security issue. So now we just return to the just ordinary times of when we need to think of the war, pandemic, and also economic security and hostility and something like that, all of these kind of things. And confrontation, and fragmentation. It's quite gloomy, but anyway. But we just return to the ordinary life.
I'm afraid that's true. But even the way the government's structured in the U.S., we have trade officials who work on non-tariff barriers and intellectual property and subsidies rules. Then we have the security people who work on tanks and planes, and having to try to have that dialogue where you talk about resilient supply chains, or talk about protecting digital networks. I'm sure governments are yet equipped to do that kind of a work.
I think one of the contributions of the European Union is that they try to provide the global public goods. Of course, the United States was the biggest provider of the global public goods after the Second World War, And based on this global public goods, the countries like the Republic of Korea achieved miraculous economic growth. And then, in terms of norm and regulation, in many cases, the European Union they started to develop this idea, and then when suddenly the United States just joined to agree this idea, then this idea or this norm is spread widely to the world. And based on this kind of the system, then Korea can be prosper. And now it's now getting more and more difficult for all the another international organization, but the European countries and the United States to provide this kind of global public goods. So I hope that my country, Republic of Korea, can play a role of the European Union to prosper the idea of the global public goods to the world. I think that is one of the things that we Republic of Korea can do for contribute to the world.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Let me ask you one final question, Dr. Kim.
Okay.
Of course, the European Union is highly involved with the Ukraine war now.
Yes.
So do you think the involvement of the EU with the Ukraine war is distracting them from Indo-Pacific?
At least in the short term, I think that you're right. I think you're right. And then the United Kingdom and the European Union member countries are now thinking about before the war, it's very active in engaged in the many issues in Indo-Pacific, especially Pacific areas. But nowadays, the European countries still argue that they want to engage in, involved in the many activities in Pacific areas. But most of their interest interest now just to the Ukraine war. But it takes time. But in the long term, I think that this war can make the European people to recognize and understand everything is connected, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So in the long term, I think European countries and peoples will come back to Asia Pacific and Indo-Pacific areas. There is the old tradition, old way of thinking of the European. Some 100 years ago or 200 years ago, their thinking will come back. Yeah, I think. Yeah.
Now, I agree with you. If there's been a criticism of the European Union in the past, it was just too inward-looking. It spent too much time looking at its own internal constitutional arrangements and didn't look at the world enough.
Yeah.
I think Ukraine's making them look outward.
Yes.
And as they look outward, they'll look outward to the Indo-Pacific too.
Yes.
I agree with that.
Yes. Whenever I visit the Europe, and then I talk about these issues with European scholars and thinkers, and then they all we have a perfect agree. Yeah, we agree with this kind of idea. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think there's a lot of future for the Korea-EU relationship. It's one we'll be paying more attention to in the future. So,
I think that Korea-EU relations will be strengthened much more because of the both parties' the recognition of necessity, and then as Korea is getting more advanced and advanced as a country and society will be more developed and advanced, then I think that then we will have more rooms for the both parties to cooperate. In the future. Yeah.
Of course, we focus a lot on Korea-US, and we pay attention to Korea-China.
Okay.
But I think in the future, Korea-EU is going to be important.
Yes. Yeah, the Republic of Korea can now the juggling the more balls, including the European Union. Yeah. Okay.
That's right. Okay.
Right.
Well, thank you very much. It was a fascinating conversation.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.